Dr. Angela Hayes walked confidently down the narrow aisle of the airplane, her white blazer neatly pressed and her small carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. Her pearl necklace glimmered softly under the cabin lights, and her calm demeanor exuded professionalism. She had just finished attending a long but fulfilling medical conference, and now all she wanted was to sit down, relax, and enjoy the flight home. As Angela reached her assigned seat, 14B, she noticed the woman sitting in 14A, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, wearing a crisp blouse, and holding a designer handbag tightly in her lap. Angela gave her a polite nod before placing her bag in the overhead compartment and preparing to take her seat. But as Angela moved to sit down, the woman's face changed. Her polite smile disappeared, replaced by a stiff expression of discomfort. She leaned forward and called out to the flight attendant, waving her hand with urgency. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, her voice sharp enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "I think there's been a mistake. I don't think I can sit here." The flight attendant, a young man with a warm smile, approached quickly. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked politely. "Yes," the woman replied, lowering her voice but making sure it was still loud enough for Angela to hear. "I was supposed to have a more comfortable seat. This isn't what I paid for." Angela, already seated, looked up at the woman, her expression calm and composed. She didn't say anything. She had encountered situations like this before and knew that silence often spoke louder than words. The flight attendant glanced at the woman's ticket and then at the seat number above her. "Ma'am, your seat is 14A. This is your assigned seat." The woman hesitated, her face flushing slightly. "Well, I can't sit here. Is there another seat available? Maybe in first class?" "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said gently. "The flight is fully booked. This is your seat." The woman huffed, crossing her arms. "I don't think this arrangement works for me." By now, the murmurs of other passengers had begun. A young man in the row behind them whispered to his companion, while a mother sitting across the aisle glanced over with a curious expression. It was clear to everyone that the woman's discomfort had little to do with the seat itself and more to do with the person sitting next to her. Angela remained calm. She adjusted her seatbelt and opened the book she had brought, ignoring the tension brewing beside her. She had dealt with worse in her career, and she wasn't about to let this ruin her day. "Ma'am, please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff," the flight attendant urged. The woman sighed dramatically, but instead of sitting, she pointed to another passenger across the aisle. "What about that seat? Maybe I could switch with them." Before the flight attendant could respond, the man sitting in the other seat shook his head. "Sorry, I'm staying right here," he said firmly, giving Angela a quick, supportive nod. The woman had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, she sank into her seat, clutching her handbag like it was a shield. She turned her body slightly away from Angela, as if trying to create as much distance as possible. Angela didn't say a word. She simply flipped a page in her book, her face serene. But inside, she couldn't help but wonder why, in this day and age, some people still allowed prejudice to control their actions. As the plane's engines roared to life, the air in the cabin felt heavy. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the tension. Little did anyone know, the journey ahead would soon reveal more about character, courage, and karma than anyone expected. As the airplane climbed steadily into the sky, the atmosphere in row 14 remained tense. Dr. Angela Hayes kept her focus on her book, though she wasn't really reading the words. She could feel the discomfort radiating from the woman next to her, who was shifting in her seat and sighing loudly every few minutes. Angela chose not to react. Years of working in stressful situations had taught her how to keep her composure. The woman, who introduced herself loudly to the flight attendant earlier as Linda, glanced over at Angela occasionally, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she wanted to say something, but Angela's calm demeanor made it hard for Linda to find an opening. Instead, Linda turned her attention to her phone, scrolling through pictures with exaggerated movements, hoping someone, anyone, would notice her frustration. Behind them, a young boy and his mother sat watching the interaction unfold. The boy whispered something to his mother, who gently shushed him, though her eyes stayed fixed on Linda and Angela. Across the aisle, an older man in a gray sweater gave Angela an encouraging smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that not everyone judged people by their appearance. The flight attendants began moving through the aisles, handing out snacks and drinks. When the flight attendant reached their row, Linda spoke up quickly. "Excuse me," she said, holding up her hand. "Is there really no way to switch seats? I just think it would be better if I could sit somewhere else." The flight attendant, who had already heard enough of Linda's complaints, kept his professional smile intact. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I mentioned earlier, the flight is full. Everyone is in their assigned seat." Linda sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. "Fine. I'll just deal with it, I guess." Angela finally glanced up from her book, her eyes meeting the flight attendant's for a brief moment. She gave him a small nod of thanks, and he responded with a subtle smile before moving on. As the attendants continued down the aisle, Linda began muttering under her breath. Though her words weren't loud enough for anyone else to hear, Angela knew the tone all too well. It was the tone of someone trying to justify their actions without admitting they were wrong. Angela turned another page in her book, pretending not to notice. She had no intention of letting Linda's attitude ruin her journey. After all, she had important work to get back to once she landed. A busy schedule filled with patients who needed her care and colleagues who respected her expertise. Suddenly, there was a small commotion a few rows ahead. A man sitting in row 10 had spilled his coffee, and the flight attendant rushed over to assist him. The distraction seemed to shift the energy in the cabin, and for a brief moment, everyone, including Linda, turned their attention to the minor accident. As the man apologized for the mess, and the flight attendant reassured him that it was no trouble, Angela couldn't help but think about the unpredictability of life. People like Linda were often so focused on their own discomfort that they missed the bigger picture. Angela believed in staying calm and focused, no matter the situation. Life had a way of balancing things out in its own time. The rest of the flight was uneventful, at least for a while. Angela continued reading, Linda continued fidgeting, and the passengers around them tried to enjoy the journey. But as the plane settled into cruising altitude, something unexpected happened that would change the tone of the entire flight. A loud gasp came from the first-class cabin, followed by the sound of a flight attendant calling out, "Is there a doctor on board? We need help immediately." Angela's head snapped up, her instincts kicking in. Without hesitation, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her professional training taking over. Linda froze in her seat, her face pale with shock, as she realized the woman she had been trying to avoid might just be the one to save the day. The air inside the cabin seemed to freeze as the urgent voice of the flight attendant echoed through the plane. "We need a doctor. Is there a doctor on board?" Passengers looked at one another, murmuring in confusion. Some craned their necks to see what was happening in the first-class section. The tension was thick, and time felt as though it had slowed. Linda sat stiffly in her seat, clutching her handbag, her earlier complaints now forgotten as panic began to creep into her expression. Angela, without hesitation, rose from her seat. She didn't make a scene or demand attention. She simply stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked calmly toward the commotion ahead. The murmurs grew louder as people realized what was happening. "Is she going to help?" a young boy behind them whispered. "That's Dr. Hayes," the older man across the aisle said, his tone filled with admiration. "She's a doctor. She knows what to do." Linda watched, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, she sat frozen, staring as Angela walked confidently down the aisle. When Angela reached the first-class cabin, she found the source of the problem. A middle-aged man, wearing a business suit, was slumped over in his seat, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The flight attendants were gathered around him, looking worried but unsure of what to do next. "I'm a doctor," Angela said, her voice steady and calm. "What happened?" The flight attendants immediately stepped aside, relief washing over their faces. "He said he wasn't feeling well earlier," one of them explained quickly. "Then he just collapsed. We don't know what's wrong." Angela nodded, her mind already racing through possible diagnoses. "Do you have a medical kit on board?" she asked. "Yes, right here," the attendant replied, handing her the kit. Angela got to work, checking the man's pulse, his breathing, and his vitals. Her movements were quick and precise, the result of years of experience. She asked the attendants for information about the man, gathering as much as she could while continuing to monitor his condition. Meanwhile, the passengers in the economy cabin watched in silence. The young boy leaned over to his mother. "Is she going to save him?" he whispered. His mother nodded, her eyes wide with admiration. "She's a doctor. She's doing everything she can." Back in row 14, Linda was sinking deeper into her seat. Her earlier arrogance and complaints now felt embarrassingly small. The woman she had been so determined to avoid was now the most important person on the plane. Linda glanced around and saw the other passengers watching Angela with respect and awe. She felt a pang of shame deep in her chest. Up in first class, Angela continued her work. The man's breathing began to steady under her care, and his color started to return. She asked for water and kept him calm, reassuring him with her steady voice. "You're going to be okay," she said gently. "Just take slow, deep breaths." The man nodded weakly, gratitude in his eyes. The flight attendants looked at Angela with admiration. "Thank you, doctor," one of them said. "You saved him." Angela gave a small smile. "I'm just doing my job." As she finished ensuring the man was stable, the passengers in the cabin began to clap. The sound grew louder, filling the plane with applause. Angela, unused to such attention, simply nodded politely and returned to her seat, leaving the first-class section in the hands of the flight attendants. When she sat back down, Linda turned to her, her face red with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. After a moment, she said quietly, "Thank you for helping him." Angela looked at her calmly. "It's what I do," she replied simply, picking up her book again. But in her eyes, there was a quiet strength that spoke louder than any words. Linda turned away, her shame growing. The lesson was clear. Character and kindness mattered far more than appearances, and Angela had shown that in a way no one on that flight would ever forget. The cabin remained quiet after Angela's heroic act. The applause had faded, but the impact of what everyone had witnessed lingered in the air. Passengers exchanged whispers and nods of approval, many sneaking glances at Angela as she calmly resumed her seat. She was the picture of composure, flipping open her book as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But for Linda, sitting beside her, the moment felt heavy and awkward. The same woman she had dismissed so rudely had just stepped up to save a life. It was a truth Linda couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wished to shrink into her seat and disappear. The flight attendant walked down the aisle, pausing by Angela's row. "Dr. Hayes," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you again for what you did. The passenger is stable now, and we'll have paramedics waiting when we land." Angela gave him a polite nod. "I'm glad I could help." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding Angela's gaze. She glanced around, hoping for a distraction, but everywhere she looked, passengers were still talking about the incident. She could hear snippets of their conversations. "That doctor was amazing," one woman whispered to her husband. "I can't believe someone complained about sitting next to her," another said, shaking her head. Linda's face flushed red. She didn't need to hear the details to know the comments were directed at her behavior. The weight of her earlier actions felt like a stone pressing on her chest. The young boy sitting behind them leaned forward, peeking over the seat. "Are you really a doctor?" he asked Angela, his wide eyes filled with admiration. Angela turned to him with a warm smile. "Yes, I am." "Like a real one. Who helps people?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "That's right," Angela replied. "I'm a surgeon. I work in a hospital where I help people every day." "Wow," the boy said, sitting back in his seat, clearly impressed. "That's so cool." Angela chuckled softly and returned to her book. The boy's excitement seemed to break the tension, but Linda still felt the shame clinging to her. She knew she needed to say something, but the words caught in her throat. How could she apologize for such blatant disrespect? As the flight continued, the passengers settled into their routines. The flight attendants passed out meals, and the hum of conversation returned to normal. But Linda couldn't shake the awkward silence between her and Angela. Finally, after what felt like hours, Linda cleared her throat. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice hesitant. Angela looked up, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes." Linda paused, fumbling for the right words. "I want to apologize. For earlier. I was wrong. I shouldn't have acted the way I did." Angela studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Linda felt a small wave of relief, though it didn't erase the guilt she carried. "You were incredible up there," she added. "The way you handled everything. It was inspiring." Angela smiled faintly. "I was just doing what I'm trained to do. Helping people is part of who I am." Linda nodded, her eyes downcast. She couldn't help but wonder how much she had missed in life by judging others too quickly. Angela's grace and professionalism had not only saved a life, but also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of character over prejudice. As the plane began its descent, the passengers started to prepare for landing. The young boy behind them tapped Angela's seat again. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice shy. "Can I be a doctor like you someday?" Angela turned, her smile warm and encouraging. "Of course you can. If you work hard, study, and always care for others, you can be anything you want to be." The boy beamed, and even his mother smiled at the interaction. For Linda, it was another humbling moment. She realized how much of an impact Angela had made on everyone in just a few short hours. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, Linda made a silent promise to herself. She would do better. Angela's quiet strength had shown her what true dignity looked like, and she knew she needed to carry that lesson forward. The airplane rolled to a stop on the tarmac, and the usual flurry of activity began. Seatbelts clicked open, overhead bins were unlashed, and passengers stretched after the long flight. But the atmosphere in row 14 was far from ordinary. A lingering sense of admiration for Angela, mixed with Linda's quiet remorse, hung in the air. As people gathered their belongings, a flight attendant approached Angela once again. "Dr. Hayes," he said, smiling warmly, "the captain asked me to thank you personally. Your quick response made all the difference today." Angela nodded graciously. "I'm just glad I could help." "Paramedics are waiting at the gate for the passenger," he added. "They'll take over from here." "Good," Angela replied, her voice calm. "He'll need follow-up care, but I think he'll be okay." Around them, passengers whispered amongst themselves, many sneaking glances at Angela, as if seeing her for the first time. The young boy from the row behind stood up and leaned over his seat, his face full of awe. "Bye, Dr. Hayes," he said with a big grin. "I'm gonna tell everyone I met a hero today." Angela chuckled softly. "Thank you, young man. Take care." His mother leaned forward, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you for everything you did. People like you make the world a better place." Angela nodded politely. "I appreciate that. Have a safe journey." Linda, still sitting quietly beside Angela, felt like a small, insignificant part of the scene unfolding around her. She hadn't moved yet, her hands gripping her handbag tightly. Watching Angela interact with the passengers only deepened her sense of regret. As the plane doors opened and people began filing out, Linda finally turned to Angela. "Dr. Hayes," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Angela turned to her expression patient. "Yes. I want to say it again," Linda said, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. I was wrong, and I was small-minded. Seeing you today, seeing what you did, it's made me realize how foolish I've been." Angela studied her for a moment, her gaze steady but kind. "Thank you for saying that," she said simply. "We all have moments when we need to reflect and grow. What matters is that we learn from them." Linda nodded, her throat tightening. "I'll remember this. I'll do better." Angela gave her a faint smile. "That's all anyone can do." As they stood to leave, Linda watched Angela walk down the aisle ahead of her head held high and her steps purposeful. It struck Linda how much grace and strength one person could carry, even in the face of adversity. At the gate, paramedics wheeled the first-class passenger onto a stretcher, with Angela giving them a quick rundown of the man's condition. The airline staff thanked her again, and a few passengers stopped to shake her hand or express their gratitude before heading toward baggage claim. Linda lingered near the gate, watching Angela as she walked away. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she should approach her again. But then Angela turned back, catching her gaze. Linda offered a small wave, and Angela returned it with a nod before disappearing into the crowd. The events of the flight stayed with Linda as she collected her luggage and made her way out of the airport. She replayed the moments in her mind, the way Angela had handled everything with poise, the respect she had earned from everyone on the plane, and the lesson Linda had learned about judging others too quickly. As Linda stepped into the bright sunlight outside, she felt something shift within her. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was a determination to change, to be better, to approach the world with the same kindness and openness that Angela had shown. Sometimes, she realized, karma doesn't just punish, it teaches, and this was one lesson she would never forget. Linda walked slowly through the airport, pulling her suitcase behind her. The flight had ended, but the memories of what happened stayed fresh in her mind. Every time she thought about the way she had acted toward Angela, a wave of shame washed over her. Yet mixed with that shame was a growing sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson she had learned and for the quiet strength Angela had shown. As Linda made her way toward the exit, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the baggage claim area. Curious, she walked closer and quickly realized what was happening. Several passengers from the flight were surrounding Angela, thanking her for her bravery and skill. Angela stood in the middle of the group, her calm demeanor unchanged as she smiled politely and exchanged a few kind words with each person. Linda hesitated, unsure if she should join the crowd. She had already apologized, but she felt like she needed to do more. Her heart raced as she debated with herself. Should she approach Angela again, or would it just seem insincere? Before she could decide, the young boy from the flight spotted her. "Hey, it's you," he said, waving enthusiastically. His mother turned and gave Linda a polite smile, though her eyes held a hint of recognition. Linda managed a small smile in return, but her focus remained on Angela. Gathering her courage, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, weaving through the small crowd until she was face to face with the doctor once more. "Dr. Hayes," Linda began, her voice steady but soft. "I know I already apologized, but I just wanted to say again how sorry I am. Not just for what I said, but for how I acted. You showed so much kindness and professionalism, even after the way I treated you. I can't thank you enough for that." Angela studied Linda for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your words," she said gently. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong and to try to make things right. That's not always easy." Linda nodded, her throat tight. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how quick I was to judge you without even knowing you. I realize now how unfair and hurtful it was." Angela smiled faintly. We all make mistakes. Linda, what matters is what we choose to do after. Growth comes from reflection and change. Linda felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you, she said quietly. Thank you for not holding it against me. Angela gave her a reassuring nod. Life is too short to carry grudges. If today's events taught us anything, it's that we never know what challenges or opportunities are just around the corner. It's better to face them with an open heart. As the small crowd around them began to disperse, Linda found herself standing alone with Angela. The noise of the airport faded into the background as Linda extended her hand. I'm going to do better, she said firmly. Thank you for teaching me that. Angela shook her hand, her grip steady and warm. You're welcome, she said simply. Take care of yourself. With that, Angela turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Linda watched her go, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. The experience had left a deep impression on her, one she knew would stay with her for a long time. As Linda stepped outside into the fresh air, she felt lighter, as if a burden she didn't even know she was carrying had been lifted. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could shape her future. And from now on, she promised herself she would approach life, and the people in it, with more kindness, understanding, and humility. The journey home wasn't just about miles traveled. It was about a change in perspective, a transformation that Linda would carry with her forever. As Linda stepped into her car in the airport parking lot, her thoughts remained on Dr. Angela Hayes. The drive home felt unusually quiet, though it wasn't because of the traffic or the weather. It was the quiet in Linda's own heart, the kind that comes when a profound lesson settles in, reshaping how you see the world. She replayed every moment from the flight, her rude refusal to sit beside Angela, the murmurs of judgment from other passengers, and Angela's quiet grace through it all. Then, of course, the life-changing moment when Angela stepped up to save a man's life, proving that who someone is on the inside matters far more than appearances or assumptions. By the time Linda reached her driveway, she had already made up her mind. She wouldn't let this experience fade into just another memory. It was time to act, to make a real change in her life. The next morning, Linda sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her laptop open in front of her. She began to write an email. It wasn't easy to put her thoughts into words, but she was determined to try. Dear Dr. Hayes, she typed, I wanted to write this letter to thank you once again for your kindness and professionalism during the flight. You saved a life that day. And in many ways, you changed mine too. I realized how quick I was to judge and how wrong that was. I am truly sorry for my behavior. I promise to carry the lessons I've learned with me and to treat others with the respect and dignity they deserve. After hitting send, Linda felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. She didn't know if Angela would ever read it, but that wasn't the point. The act of acknowledging her mistake and making amends was what mattered most. Angela, meanwhile, had returned to her busy life as a surgeon. She had nearly forgotten the events of the flight until she saw Linda's email in her inbox a few days later. Sitting in her office after a long day of surgeries, Angela read the message carefully, a faint smile spreading across her face. She didn't hold grudges, and she was glad to see that Linda had taken the experience to heart. Angela drafted a quick response. Dear Linda, thank you for your kind words. I appreciate your reflection and sincerity. It takes strength to admit when we're wrong and even more to work toward change. I'm glad our paths crossed, and I wish you all the best moving forward. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness or understanding could ripple outward, creating change in ways she might never fully see. Months later, Linda found herself in a similar situation, but this time, she was on the other side of the lesson. At a work event, a colleague was being unfairly judged for their appearance. Linda didn't hesitate. She stepped in, defending the person and reminding her peers to focus on character rather than assumptions. Afterward, the colleague approached her with gratitude. Linda smiled, thinking of Angela and how that one flight had reshaped her entire perspective. "It's just the right thing to do," Linda said simply. Back at the hospital, Angela continued her work, unaware of the lasting impact she had made on Linda's life. For her, it had been another day of doing what she was trained to do, helping people in need. But for Linda, it had been a moment of transformation, a chance to see the world through a new lens. Both women went on with their lives, connected by an unspoken bond. One had shown grace in the face of prejudice, and the other had learned to see beyond her own narrow views. Their story was proof that even the smallest encounters can lead to the greatest changes. And sometimes, karma isn't about punishment. It's about delivering the right lesson at the right time.